The wagon wheels had stopped turning 3 days ago, and Rebecca Hastings knew if she did not find shelter soon, her unborn child might never take a first breath in this world. She pressed one hand against the swell of her belly beneath the faded calico dress, feeling the flutter of movement that reminded her she was responsible for more than just her own survival now. And with the Montana sky turning gray with the promise of early snow in October of 1876, she understood that sleeping in this broken-down wagon much longer would be a death sentence for them both. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead for 2 months, shot during a card game gone wrong in a dusty saloon 3 territories back. She had watched them lower him into the ground without tears because shock had frozen everything inside her. And then she had climbed onto their wagon alone and kept moving west because staying in that place would have meant facing questions she could not answer and sympathies she could not bear. The baby had been conceived in happier times, back when Thomas still smiled at her over morning coffee and talked about the ranch they would build together, before gambling had sunk its teeth into him and changed him into someone she barely recognized. The wagon had lurched to its final stop just outside the town of Dillon, Montana, with a broken axle that Rebecca had neither the money nor the knowledge to fix. She had unhitched the horses and sold them to a livery owner for enough coins to buy food for a week, maybe 2 if she was careful. And then she had made the wagon her home because she had nowhere else to go. She hung a blanket across the opening for privacy and rationed the dried meat and hard biscuits she had purchased. And each night she lay on the thin bedroll and wondered how her life had come to this. On the 4th morning, she woke to the sound of hammering. Rebecca pushed aside the blanket and squinted into the bright autumn sunlight, her body stiff from another night on the hard wagon bed. The hammering continued, steady and rhythmic, and when her eyes adjusted she saw a man about 50 yards away, driving stakes into the ground with focused determination. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and a blue cotton shirt, with a hat tipped low over his face. A horse stood nearby, a beautiful bay mare that watched its owner work with patient eyes. She climbed down from the wagon carefully, one hand steadying herself against the weathered wood while the other supported her belly. Her feet touched the cool grass, and she felt light-headed for a moment, reminding herself that she had eaten very little yesterday to conserve her supplies. The man continued hammering, either unaware of her presence or choosing to ignore it, and Rebecca found herself walking toward him with questions forming on her lips. "Excuse me," she called out when she was close enough to be heard over the hammering. "What are you doing?" The man paused mid-swing and straightened, finally turning to look at her. He had a weathered face that suggested he was in his late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of summer sky. There was a gentleness in those eyes that surprised her, though his expression remained neutral and guarded. "Building," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "Building what?" Rebecca asked, wrapping her arms around herself against the morning chill. "A house," he replied, and then he turned back to his work as though that settled the matter. Rebecca stood there in confusion, watching him drive another stake into the ground with powerful, efficient strikes. "I do not understand. This land, it is not yours." "It is now," the man said without pausing in his work. "Filed the claim yesterday, 160 acres under the Homestead Act." "But why here?" Rebecca pressed, glancing back at her broken wagon. "Why right here, right now?" The man stopped hammering again and met her gaze directly. "Because you need it," he said quietly. Then he picked up another stake and moved to the next marker position, leaving Rebecca standing in stunned silence. She wanted to protest, to tell him that she was not his responsibility and that she did not need charity from strangers. but the words died in her throat because they would have been lies, and something about this man's straightforward manner made lying seem impossible. She did need help. She needed it desperately. "I cannot pay you," Rebecca said finally, forcing the words out past the tightness in her throat. "Did not ask you to," the man replied, hammering another steak. "I do not even know your name." "Franklin Noble," he said, pausing long enough to tip his hat toward her before returning to work. "Most folks call me Frank." "I am Rebecca," she offered. "Rebecca Hastings." Frank nodded once, acknowledging her introduction, but he did not stop working. Rebecca watched him for a few more minutes, trying to make sense of this strange situation, and then she walked slowly back to her wagon because standing made her dizzy, and she needed to sit down. For the rest of that day, Frank worked with single-minded focus. Rebecca observed him from the wagon, fascinated despite herself by his methodical approach to the construction. He had brought a full load of timber on a wagon that must have been parked somewhere nearby, and he worked through the morning laying out the foundation posts with careful precision. He did not speak to her again, did not even look in her direction, but there was something deliberate about his positioning, the way he had chosen to build the house between her wagon and the prevailing wind, that told her his every action was made with her comfort in mind. Around midday, Rebecca forced herself to eat a small portion of dried meat and a biscuit, washing it down with water from the canteen she filled at the town pump each morning. Her supplies were dwindling faster than she had hoped, and she knew she would need to find work soon. Though what kind of work a pregnant widow could find in a frontier town, she had no idea. Most respectable establishments would not hire a woman in her condition, and the less respectable ones were not options she was willing to consider. She must have dozed off in the afternoon, because when she opened her eyes again, the sun was lower in the sky, and Frank was sitting near a small fire he had built, cooking something in a black iron pan. The smell of frying bacon made Rebecca's stomach clench with hunger so intense it was almost painful. She had not eaten real cooked food in days, and the aroma was almost unbearable. Frank looked up and caught her staring. Without a word, he pulled a tin plate from his supplies and loaded it with bacon and beans, then walked over to the wagon and held it out to her. "I cannot," Rebecca said automatically, though her hands were already reaching for the plate. "You can," Frank said firmly, "and you will. No point in building a house if you are too weak to walk into it." Rebecca took the plate with trembling hands, and the first bite of hot food brought tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with the temperature. She ate slowly, trying to maintain some dignity, while Frank returned to his fire and ate his own meal in silence. When she finished, he took her empty plate without comment and washed it along with his own using water from a barrel on his wagon. As darkness fell, Frank banked his fire and gathered his tools. "I will be back at dawn," he told Rebecca. "Keep the fire going if you get cold." "Why are you doing this?" Rebecca asked, the question that had been burning inside her all day finally breaking free. "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "My sister," he said finally. "She died 2 years back. She was carrying a baby and her husband had gone off to the goldfields and never came back. She did not have anybody to help her, and by the time I heard she was in trouble and rode out to find her, it was too late. Found her in a line shack up in the hills, her and the baby both gone." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "So am I," Frank said. "But sorry does not change what happened. This does." He gestured toward the foundation stakes barely visible in the darkness. "I cannot help my sister now, but I can help you. Seems like the least I can do." Before Rebecca could respond, he had mounted his horse and ridden off toward town. leaving her alone with a warm fire and thoughts too complicated to untangle. She lay awake for a long time that night, one hand resting on her belly, trying to understand what kind of man would build a house for a stranger because of a sister he could not save. Frank returned at dawn as promised, riding up in a wagon loaded with more timber and supplies. Rebecca had managed to keep the fire going through the night as he had suggested, and she had used some of her precious water to wash her face and hands, wanting to look as presentable as possible even though she knew her appearance was far from what it should be. Her dress was stained and worn. Her hair hung in a simple braid down her back because she had neither the energy nor the materials for a more elaborate style, and she knew there were dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. Frank nodded to her in greeting and immediately set to work. Rebecca watched as he began digging post holes with an auger, his movements steady and powerful. The morning was cold, frost still clinging to the grass in shadowed spots, and she could see Frank's breath misting in the air as he worked. "Can I help?" Rebecca asked, walking over to where he was working. She felt useless just sitting and watching, and despite her condition she was not yet so far along that she was completely helpless. Frank paused and looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Can you measure?" he asked finally. "Yes," Rebecca said, relieved to have something useful to do. Frank showed her how to measure the distances between posts using a length of rope he had marked at specific intervals. It was simple work but important, and Rebecca focused on it with gratitude, happy to contribute in some small way to the project. They worked together in companionable silence, Frank digging and setting posts while Rebecca ensured the spacing was correct. Around mid-morning, a wagon approached from the direction of town, driven by an older woman with steel-gray hair and a no-nonsense expression. She pulled up near the construction site and climbed down with surprising agility for someone who must have been in her 60s. "Frank Noble, what in heaven's name are you building out here?" the woman called out, hands on her hips. "A house, Mrs. Patterson," Frank replied, not pausing in his work. "I can see that," Mrs. Patterson said impatiently. "What I am asking is why and for whom." Frank gestured toward Rebecca with his chin. "For Mrs. Hastings. She needs a place to live." Mrs. Patterson turned her sharp gaze on Rebecca, taking in her condition and circumstances with a single sweeping glance. Rebecca felt herself being assessed and judged, and she straightened her spine, meeting the older woman's eyes directly despite her embarrassment at being in such reduced circumstances. "A widow?" Mrs. Patterson asked bluntly. "Yes, madam," Rebecca replied quietly. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "How far along?" "About 6 months," Rebecca said. Mrs. Patterson walked over to her wagon and pulled out a large basket covered with a cloth. "Brought some food from town. Heard Frank had filed a homestead claim and figured he might need feeding. Appears I should have brought more." She uncovered the basket to reveal fresh bread, a crock of butter, a jar of jam, several apples, and a tin of cookies. Rebecca's eyes widened at the bounty, and her stomach growled audibly despite having eaten Frank's cooking the night before. Mrs. Patterson's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "When did you last have a proper meal, child?" "I eat," Rebecca said defensively. "That was not what I asked." Mrs. Patterson set the basket down and studied Rebecca with a practiced eye. "You are too thin for a woman carrying a baby. Frank, you make sure she eats at least 3 times a day, you hear me?" "Yes, madam," Frank said, and there was a hint of amusement in his voice that suggested he was accustomed to taking orders from Mrs. Patterson. "Now then," Mrs. Patterson continued, turning back to Rebecca. "I run the boarding house in town, and I also happen to be the closest thing Dillon has to a midwife. When your time comes, you send for me. Frank knows where to find me." I cannot afford, Rebecca began, but Mrs. Patterson waved her hand dismissively. Did I ask you about money? You just make sure you eat properly and rest when you need to. Growing a baby is hard work, and doing it while sleeping in a wagon is foolishness. How long before this house is livable, Frank? Frank straightened and surveyed the work he had completed so far. If the weather holds and I work steady, maybe 2 weeks for a basic structure, 3 to make it comfortable. 2 weeks, Mrs. Patterson repeated, looking at Rebecca's wagon with obvious disapproval. Child, you cannot stay in that wagon for 2 more weeks. Come stay at the boarding house. I cannot afford, Rebecca repeated, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Then work for your keep, Mrs. Patterson said practically. I can always use help with laundry and mending, and you can do that kind of work sitting down. You will have a real bed and hot meals, and I will not have to worry about you freezing to death out here if we get an early snow. Rebecca wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence and dignity, but she knew that Mrs. Patterson was right. The nights were getting colder and her blankets were thin. I will work hard, she promised. I will earn my keep. I am sure you will, Mrs. Patterson said briskly. Now eat something from that basket and then gather your things. You can ride back to town with me. Rebecca glanced at Frank, who had returned to digging post holes. He did not look at her, but he said, "It is a good idea. You will be safer in town." Something about his careful lack of expression told Rebecca that he had arranged this somehow, that Mrs. Patterson's timely arrival was not the coincidence it appeared to be. She should have been angry at the manipulation, but instead she felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she could not quite name. "Thank you," she said to both of them, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a 2-story building on Dillon's Main Street, painted white with green shutters and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Rebecca's room was small but clean, with a real bed covered in a faded quilt, a washstand with a porcelain pitcher and bowl, and a window that looked out over the street. After weeks of sleeping in the wagon, it felt like luxury. True to her word, Rebecca worked for her keep. Mrs. Patterson kept her busy with mending and light housework that could be done sitting down. And in return, Rebecca had 3 hot meals a day and a warm place to sleep. The other boarders were mostly single men who worked in town or on nearby ranches, and they treated Rebecca with polite respect, perhaps warned by Mrs. Patterson to mind their manners. Every morning, Rebecca watched from her window as Frank rode past on his way out to the homestead. Every evening he rode back, his shoulders often slumped with exhaustion but his expression satisfied. On Sundays, when he did not work on the house, he would stop by the boarding house and sit on the porch with Rebecca, not saying much but keeping her company in his quiet way. "How is the house coming?" Rebecca would ask, hungry for details about the place being built for her. "Good," Frank would reply. "Got the frame up, starting on the roof tomorrow." "You should not be doing all this work alone," Rebecca said one Sunday afternoon in early November. The air was crisp and cold, and she had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. "It is too much for one man." "I have help," Frank said. "A few fellows from town come out when they have time, and I am used to working hard." "Where is your home?" Rebecca asked, realizing she knew almost nothing about this man who was building her a house. "Had a place up near Helena," Frank said. "Sold it after my sister died. Did not seem right staying there without her nearby. I have been drifting since then, doing ranch work mostly. Figured it was time to settle down again, build something permanent." "And you chose Dillon?" Rebecca asked. Frank was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains visible in the distance. "I chose here," he said finally, and something about the way he said it made Rebecca's heart beat a little faster. The house was finished 3 weeks later, on a cold November afternoon when the sky threatened snow but had not yet delivered on the promise. Frank came to the boarding house and knocked on the door, his hat in his hands and an expression of quiet pride on his weathered face. "It is ready," he told Rebecca, "if you would like to see it." Mrs. Patterson insisted on coming along, and she drove them out to the homestead in her wagon. Rebecca sat in the back, wrapped in a heavy coat Mrs. Patterson had loaned her. Her hands folded over her belly where the baby was doing somersaults that suggested it shared her anticipation. When the wagon crested the small rise that looked down on the building site, Rebecca gasped. Where there had been nothing but grass and Frank's stakes 3 weeks ago, there now stood a small but solid house. It was not large, just 2 rooms from what she could see, but it had real glass windows and a stone chimney and a covered porch across the front. It looked like a home, like a place where a person could build a life, and Rebecca felt tears streaming down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. "Oh, Frank," she whispered, "it is beautiful." Frank looked pleased but embarrassed by her reaction. He helped her down from the wagon and led her to the front door, which he opened with a flourish that seemed out of character for his normally reserved demeanor. The inside was simple, but well constructed. The main room held a wood stove that was already radiating heat, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, and open shelves for storage. A doorway led to a smaller room that held a real bed frame and a dresser. The floors were smooth pine boards and calico curtains hung at the windows. "The furniture is just borrowed," Frank said quickly, "from folks in town. But Mrs. Patterson said you would need the basics and people were happy to help. You can replace things with your own when you are able." Rebecca walked slowly through the space, touching the table, the rocking chair, the window sills. "I do not have words," she said finally. "How do I thank you for something like this?" "You do not need to thank me," Frank said. "You just need to be safe and warm. That is enough." Mrs. Patterson had been conducting her own inspection, and now she nodded with approval. "You did good work, Frank Noble. This place will keep her comfortable through the winter. You put in a good root cellar too, I see." "Yes, madam," Frank confirmed. "Stocked it with potatoes and carrots and apples. Should last a good while." Rebecca turned to stare at him. "You stocked it. Frank, I cannot keep accepting all this from you. It is too much." "It is what neighbors do," Frank said firmly. "And I am your neighbor now. My claim is right next to yours." "Your claim?" Rebecca repeated, confused. Frank shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "I filed for the property adjacent to this one. Figured I would build my own place come spring. For now, I am staying in town at the boarding house." "Oh," Rebecca said softly, trying to process this information. Frank would be her neighbor, close enough to help if she needed it, but far enough away to be proper. It was a thoughtful arrangement, typical of the careful way he did everything. "Now then," Mrs. Patterson said briskly, breaking the moment. "Let us get your things moved out here, Rebecca. Frank, you can drive us back to town to collect her belongings, such as they are." Moving Rebecca's possessions took only 1 trip because she owned so little. Her clothes fit in a single carpet bag. Her cooking supplies amounted to a dented pot and a frying pan. And her personal items consisted of a Bible, a photograph of her parents who had died years ago, and the silver locket Thomas had given her when they married. Everything she had left from her old life fit easily in the back of Mrs. Patterson's wagon. When they returned to the homestead, Frank helped Rebecca arrange her belongings while Mrs. Patterson built up the fire in the stove and made coffee using supplies she had brought from town. The light was fading by the time everything was settled, and Mrs. Patterson declared it was time to head back to Dillon before full dark. "You will be all right out here alone?" Mrs. Patterson asked Rebecca, her stern expression softening with concern. "I will be fine," Rebecca assured her. "I have the rifle Frank left and I know how to use it. And I am not truly alone, am I?" She glanced at Frank, who had stepped outside to hitch up the horses for Mrs. Patterson's return journey. "No, you are not," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "Frank will check on you every day, I am sure. That boy may be quiet, but he has a good heart. Lost too much already in his life. I am glad to see him caring about something again." After they left, Rebecca stood in the doorway of her new house and watched the wagon disappear toward town. The sun had set completely now, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The land stretched out around her in all directions, vast and empty and somehow beautiful in its loneliness. She rested one hand on her belly and felt the baby move, a gentle reminder that she was not truly alone even when no other person was near. The next morning, Rebecca woke to the sound of chopping wood. She rose from the bed, which had been blissfully comfortable after so many nights on the wagon floor, and wrapped a shawl around her nightgown before going to the window. Frank was outside splitting firewood with rhythmic efficiency, adding to the already impressive pile stacked against the side of the house. Rebecca dressed quickly and went outside, pulling her coat tight against the morning cold. "Frank Noble, what are you doing here so early?" "Making sure you have enough wood for winter," Frank replied, setting up another log on the chopping block. "This will last you a good 2 months if you are careful with the fire." "You should be building your own house," Rebecca protested, "not spending all your time taking care of me." Frank lowered the axe and looked at her directly. "My house can wait until spring. Making sure you are settled cannot." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, and Rebecca felt something shift between them, some acknowledgement of feelings that neither was quite ready to name. Frank was the first to look away, turning back to his wood chopping, and Rebecca went inside to prepare breakfast with the supplies Mrs. Patterson had sent. She made coffee and fried eggs and bacon in her dented pan, and when Frank finished with the wood, she called him inside to eat. He washed up at the pump outside and then sat at the table, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that Rebecca was beginning to recognize as something he did when he was nervous or uncomfortable. "You do not have to feed me," Frank said. "Yes, I do," Rebecca replied, setting a plate in front of him. "You have done so much for me. The very least I can do is share a meal." They ate in companionable silence, and when Frank finished, he thanked her quietly and said he needed to get back to town for supplies. But he returned that afternoon with lumber and began building a barn on the property, explaining that come spring, she would need a place to keep animals if she planned to make the homestead work. This became their pattern. Frank would arrive early in the morning, work on some project around the homestead, share a meal with Rebecca, and then return to town before dark to maintain propriety. Some days he worked on the barn, other days he reinforced the house, or improved the root cellar, or did 100 other tasks that Rebecca had not even known needed doing. He rarely spoke beyond the necessary, but his actions communicated everything his words did not. Rebecca found herself looking forward to his arrivals each morning, listening for the sound of his horse, and feeling a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby when she saw him riding toward the house. She told herself it was simply gratitude that anyone would feel warmly toward a person who had helped them so much. But she knew in her heart it was more than that. One afternoon in late November, Rebecca was sitting in the rocking chair near the fire, mending one of Frank's shirts that had torn on a nail during his work. Frank was outside repairing a fence he had built to mark the property boundaries, and the afternoon sun slanted through the windows in golden shafts that made the simple room look almost beautiful. She was so focused on her stitching that she did not hear Frank come inside until he spoke. "You do not need to do that." Rebecca looked up, smiling. "I know, but you do so much for me. I want to do something useful in return." Frank crossed to where she sat and lowered himself carefully onto the floor beside the rocking chair, sitting with his back against the wall and his long legs stretched out in front of him. It was an oddly intimate position, putting him at eye level with where Rebecca sat, and she felt her heart begin to beat faster. "Rebecca," Frank said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without her surname attached. "I need to say something, and I am not good with words, so I hope you will bear with me." Rebecca set down the mending, giving him her full attention. "I am listening." Frank took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on his hands. "I know you are still grieving your husband. I know you have been through more than any person should have to bear. And I know that the last thing you probably want to think about right now is the future beyond getting through each day and bringing your baby safely into the world." "That is true," Rebecca said softly. "But I need you to know," Frank continued, finally looking up at her with those summer sky eyes, "that I am not doing all this just out of obligation to my sister's memory. I am doing it because somewhere between seeing you climb out of that wagon the first morning and sitting here with you now, I have come to care for you. More than care for you, if I am being honest." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected Frank's feelings might mirror her own, but hearing him speak them aloud made everything suddenly real and immediate and terrifying. "I am not asking you to return those feelings," Frank said quickly. "I know I am not the kind of man women usually look at twice. I am quiet and I spend more time with horses than people, and I do not have much to offer beyond hard work and honest intentions. But I wanted you to know how I feel, so there is no confusion about why I am here every day. It is not charity. It is not obligation. It is because I want to be here with you." "Frank," Rebecca whispered, overwhelmed by the raw honesty in his words. "You do not need to say anything," Frank said, starting to rise. "I just needed you to know." "Wait," Rebecca said, reaching out to touch his arm. Frank froze, looking down at where her small hand rested on his shirt sleeve. "Please wait." Frank settled back down, his expression carefully neutral, and Rebecca tried to organize her tumbling thoughts into something coherent. "I was married for 3 years," Rebecca began slowly. "And for the first year, I thought I was happy. Thomas was charming and handsome, and he said all the right things. But then the gambling started, and I learned the difference between pretty words and real kindness. He would promise me things and never follow through. He would tell me he loved me and then disappear for days to play cards. By the end, I did not even know who he was anymore." Frank listened without interrupting, his blue eyes full of understanding. "You have known me for less than 2 months," Rebecca continued. "And in that time, you have built me a house, ensured I have food and warmth and safety, and asked nothing in return. You have shown me more genuine care than Thomas ever did in 3 years of marriage. So when you say you are not the kind of man women look at twice, you are wrong. Because I look at you every day and I see someone strong and kind and honest. I see someone I have come to rely on and trust and, yes, care for very deeply." Frank's expression shifted, hope flickering in his eyes. "Rebecca." "But," Rebecca said, and she saw him brace for rejection. "I am 6 months pregnant with another man's child. I am not free to think about the future the way I would like to be. My life is complicated and uncertain, and I cannot make promises when I do not know what the coming months will bring." "I am not asking for promises," Frank said firmly. "I am just asking for a chance. Let me be here for you. Let me help you through this. And when the time is right, if the time is ever right, maybe we can talk about what comes next." Rebecca felt tears welling up, but they were not tears of sadness. "You would truly want to raise another man's child. I would truly want to be with you," Frank corrected gently. "And any child you bring into this world would be lucky to have you as a mother. I would be honored to be part of that child's life, if you would let me." The tears spilled over then, running down Rebecca's cheeks, and Frank reached up with one work-roughened hand to brush them away with surprising gentleness. Rebecca leaned into his touch, and when Frank pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of her belly, she rested her head against his shoulder and let herself be held. They sat that way for a long time, the afternoon light fading around them and the fire crackling softly in the stove. When Frank finally rose to leave for town, he paused at the door and looked back at her. "I will see you tomorrow," he asked, as though uncertain whether their conversation might have changed things. "Yes," Rebecca said, smiling through her tears. "I will see you tomorrow." Winter arrived in earnest in December, bringing snow and bitter cold that turned the Montana landscape into an endless expanse of white. Frank came every day regardless of the weather, often staying longer to make sure Rebecca's fire was built up enough to last through the night. On the worst days, when the wind howled and the snow fell so thick you could barely see 10 feet in any direction, Rebecca would insist that Frank stay rather than risk the ride back to town. On those nights, Frank would sleep on the floor near the stove, wrapped in blankets, while Rebecca took the bed in the other room. It was a proper arrangement that protected Rebecca's reputation even as it allowed them to spend more time together. They would talk late into the evening, sharing stories from their pasts, and Rebecca learned about Frank's childhood on a farm in Missouri, his journey west with his family, the death of his parents in a fever outbreak, and the close bond he had shared with his sister. In turn, Rebecca told Frank about growing up in Ohio, the death of her parents that had left her alone at 19, and her marriage to Thomas that had seemed like a solution to loneliness, but had become its own kind of isolation. She spoke honestly about Thomas's failings and her own mistakes, and Frank listened without judgment, his quiet presence a comfort in itself. "You think we ever truly get over losing people?" Rebecca asked one snowy evening in mid-December. They were sitting by the fire, Frank in the rocking chair he had insisted Rebecca take while she sat in one of the regular chairs, her feet propped up because they had been swelling lately. Frank considered the question carefully. "I do not think we get over it," he said finally. "But I think we learn to carry it differently. My sister's death nearly broke me at first. I could not see any reason to keep going. But then I realized that stopping would mean all the things she wanted for me would never happen. She always wanted me to find a good woman and settle down, to build a life that meant something. So maybe by doing that, I am honoring her memory better than I would by just being sad about her being gone." "That is a beautiful way to think about it," Rebecca said softly. "What about you?" Frank asked. "Do you think you will ever forgive Thomas for leaving you in such a difficult position?" Rebecca was quiet for a long time, one hand absently rubbing her belly. "I think I already have," she said eventually. "Not because what he did was right, but because holding on to anger takes energy I need for other things. Thomas made his choices, and they led to his death. I made mine, including the choice to marry him despite warning signs I should have heeded. But those choices led me here, to this place, to you. And I cannot bring myself to completely regret a path that brought me to something good." Frank's expression softened, and he reached over to take her hand. "You are remarkable, Rebecca Hastings." "I am simply tired of being angry," Rebecca replied, but she squeezed his hand and did not let go. As Christmas approached, Mrs. Patterson organized a celebration at the boarding house and insisted that both Frank and Rebecca attend. Rebecca had not been to town in weeks, and she felt nervous about appearing in public in her condition, but Mrs. Patterson would not take no for an answer. "People know your situation," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly when she drove out to collect Rebecca. "And anyone who would judge you for being widowed and pregnant can answer to me. You are part of this community now, and you will be at our Christmas celebration." The boarding house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and what seemed like the entire town of Dillon had crowded into the main rooms. Rebecca felt self-conscious at first, aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations, but Mrs. Patterson kept her close and introduced her to so many people that Rebecca quickly lost track of names and faces. Frank appeared at her side at some point in the evening, 2 cups of hot cider in his hands. "You look overwhelmed," he observed with a slight smile. "There are so many people," Rebecca said, accepting the cider gratefully. "I did not realize Dillon was so large." "It is not really," Frank said. "But folks come in from the ranches around here for celebrations. Winters are long and lonely. People need excuses to gather." They found a relatively quiet corner and watched the festivities together. Someone had brought a fiddle and was playing cheerful tunes while children ran underfoot, and adults talked and laughed with the particular energy of people determined to enjoy themselves despite the harsh realities of frontier life. "I got you something," Frank said suddenly, pulling a small wrapped package from his coat pocket. "For Christmas." Rebecca looked at the package in surprise. "Frank, you have already given me so much." "This is different," Frank said, pressing it into her hands. "Open it." Rebecca unwrapped the package carefully, pulling away the brown paper to reveal a delicate wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a silver hairbrush with an ornate handle engraved with flowers. "Frank," Rebecca breathed, lifting the brush carefully. "This is too much." "I saw it in the general store," Frank explained, looking embarrassed. "And I thought of you. I know you do not have many nice things left, and every woman deserves something beautiful." Rebecca felt tears threatening again, something that happened far too easily these days. "I did not get you anything," she said miserably. "You gave me the best gift already," Frank said quietly. "You let me be part of your life. That is more than enough." Rebecca looked at this man who had built her a house before he even knew her name, who had shown her more kindness than she had known in years, who spoke so simply, but always said exactly what she needed to hear. "I think I am falling in love with you, Frank Noble," she whispered, barely audible over the noise of the celebration around them. Frank's entire face transformed, his usual serious expression giving way to a smile of such pure joy that Rebecca could not help but smile in return. "I have been in love with you since the day you walked toward me in that faded dress with your chin up and your eyes full of determination," he said. "I was just waiting for you to catch up." They stood together in their quiet corner, surrounded by celebration but focused only on each other, and Rebecca felt something settle in her heart that had been restless and frightened for so long. This was what she had needed. Not rescue, though Frank had certainly rescued her, but partnership. Respect. A love built on actions rather than words, on steadiness rather than passion, on the kind of solid foundation that could weather anything. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, and Rebecca gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Frank's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Are you all right? Is it time?" "No, no," Rebecca assured him, laughing a little. "The baby is just active. I think it likes the music." Frank's hand hovered near Rebecca's belly, uncertain. "May I?" he asked hesitantly. Rebecca guided his hand to where the baby was moving, and she watched Frank's face as he felt the life moving beneath his palm. His expression was full of such wonder and tenderness that Rebecca felt her heart swell almost painfully in her chest. "That is amazing," Frank murmured. A whole person just waiting to meet the world. A whole person who is going to need a father, Rebecca said softly, if you meant what you said about wanting to be part of this child's life. Frank's eyes met hers, serious and intent. I meant every word, but when the time is right, Rebecca. You have been through too much to rush into anything. Let us take this slow and do it right. All right, Rebecca agreed. We will take it slow. January brought the worst of the winter weather, with temperatures dropping so low that even Frank had to admit some days were too dangerous for travel between town and the homestead. During those times, Rebecca stayed warm in her house and worked on preparing for the baby's arrival. She had traded some mending work for fabric, and she spent long hours sewing tiny gowns and blankets, her hands busy even as her mind wandered to thoughts of Frank and the future they might build together. Mrs. Patterson visited when the weather allowed, bringing supplies and checking on Rebecca's health with a practiced eye. You are doing well, she pronounced during one visit in late January. Baby is positioned right, and you still have some weeks to go, but it will not be long now. I am frightened, Rebecca admitted. I have never done this before, and I will be alone. You will not be alone, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. When your time comes, you send Frank for me immediately. I have delivered more babies than I can count, and I have never lost a mother yet. You will be fine. As February arrived, Rebecca found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable. Her back ached constantly, her feet swelled no matter how often she elevated them, and sleeping had become nearly impossible. Frank noticed her discomfort and began staying over more frequently, sleeping near the fire so he would be close if she needed help during the night. You should be in town, Frank said one morning after Rebecca had spent most of the night pacing because lying down was too uncomfortable. At Mrs. Patterson's boarding house where she can keep an eye on you. I want to stay here, Rebecca insisted. In my own home. This is where I want my baby to be born. Frank looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. Then I am staying too, properly be damned. I am not leaving you out here alone. People will talk, Rebecca warned. Let them talk, Frank said firmly. Your safety is more important than gossip. So Frank moved his things from the boarding house to the homestead, setting up his bedroll in the main room and maintaining careful propriety even as he stayed close enough to help Rebecca when she needed it. Mrs. Patterson came out to check on them and, after assessing the situation, merely nodded her approval and left additional supplies. The baby came on a cold February night, 3 weeks before Rebecca had expected. She woke to cramping pain and wetness between her legs, and she called out for Frank in a voice tight with fear. Frank was at her side in seconds, fully alert despite having been asleep moments before. Is it time? I think so, Rebecca gasped as another pain seized her. Frank, it is too early. Something is wrong. Nothing is wrong, Frank said with a calm he clearly did not feel. Babies come when they are ready, not when we expect them. I am going to ride for Mrs. Patterson. Will you be all right for an hour? Please hurry, Rebecca whispered. Frank bundled up against the bitter cold and rode hard for town, and Rebecca spent the longest hour of her life alone in the house, timing pains that came with increasing frequency and intensity. When Frank finally returned with Mrs. Patterson, Rebecca had never been so relieved to see anyone in her life. Mrs. Patterson took charge immediately, sending Frank to heat water and gather clean linens while she examined Rebecca. Baby is coming fast, she announced. This will not be a long labor, which is good. You are doing fine, Rebecca. Just breathe through the pains and push when I tell you. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Frank stayed in the main room as was proper, but Rebecca could hear him pacing, and she drew strength from knowing he was near. Mrs. Patterson was steady and encouraging, coaching Rebecca through each contraction. And just as the first light of dawn was breaking through the windows, Rebecca gave one final push and heard the sharp cry of a newborn baby. "A boy," Mrs. Patterson announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A perfect, healthy boy." Rebecca reached for her son with trembling arms, and when Mrs. Patterson placed the baby on her chest, still wet and crying, Rebecca felt love crash over her with an intensity that left her breathless. This tiny person, with his scrunched face and waving fists, was hers. He was here and he was healthy and he was beautiful. "Can Frank come in?" Rebecca asked, when the baby had been cleaned and wrapped in one of the blankets Rebecca had made. Mrs. Patterson looked disapproving but relented. "For a moment. You need to rest." Frank entered the bedroom cautiously, his eyes going immediately to Rebecca and the bundle in her arms. He approached slowly, as though afraid he might break something, and when he reached the bedside, he looked down at the baby with an expression of absolute wonder. "He is perfect," Frank said softly. "Would you like to hold him?" Rebecca asked. Frank looked uncertain but nodded, and Rebecca carefully transferred the baby into his arms. Frank held the infant with surprising competence, supporting the small head with one large hand, and the baby settled against his chest with a contented sigh that made Rebecca's heart ache with emotion. "What will you name him?" Frank asked, unable to take his eyes off the baby. Rebecca had been thinking about this for weeks. "I want to name him after you," she said. "If you do not mind, Franklin Hastings, so he carries the name of the man who saved his mother's life." Frank's eyes snapped up to meet hers, bright with unshed tears. "Rebecca, I would be honored." "All right, enough of that," Mrs. Patterson said briskly, though her own eyes looked suspiciously damp. "Out, Frank. Mother and baby need to rest. You can come back later and make cow eyes at them both." Frank carefully returned baby Franklin to Rebecca's arms and squeezed her hand gently before leaving the room. Rebecca held her son close, breathing in his sweet baby scent, and felt peace wash over her despite her exhaustion. She had done it. Her baby was here and healthy, and she had survived. Against all odds, she had survived. Recovery was slow, and Rebecca was grateful for Frank's steady presence through those first difficult weeks. He helped with everything from cooking to laundry to walking the floor with baby Franklin during those long nights when the infant refused to sleep. He did it all without complaint, and Rebecca watched him fall in love with her son just as surely as she had fallen in love with him. "You are good with him," Rebecca observed one afternoon in early March. Frank was holding Franklin, gently bouncing him while the baby made the adorable cooing sounds that had become his primary form of communication during wakeful periods. "He is an easy baby to love," Frank replied, smiling down at the infant. "Just like his mother." "Frank Noble, was that a flirtation?" Rebecca teased. "You are getting bold in your old age." "I am 27, Frank protested. "That is hardly old." "Well, I am 22, which makes me practically a child by comparison," Rebecca said with a laugh. She had missed laughing. It felt good to find joy again after so much hardness. Frank's expression grew serious. "Rebecca, I know we said we would take things slow, but I have to tell you, these past few weeks, living here with you and Franklin, taking care of you both, it has felt like we are already a family. And I do not want to wait any more. I want to make this official and real. I want to marry you if you will have me." Rebecca's breath caught. She had known this moment was coming, had felt the inevitability of it building between them, but hearing Frank actually propose still sent her heart racing. "Frank," she began. "Let me finish," Frank interrupted gently. "I know I am not fancy or exciting. I cannot promise you an easy life or wealth or any of the things some men might offer. But I can promise you that I will work hard every day to provide for you and Franklin. I can promise that I will be faithful and honest, and that I will love you both for the rest of my life. I can promise that you will never have to face hardship alone again, because I will be beside you through everything. If that is enough, if I am enough, then please say you will marry me." Rebecca looked at this good, steady man who had given her everything when she had nothing, who had shown her what real love looked like, who had already proven himself to be the father her son deserved. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Frank Noble. You are more than enough. You are everything." Frank's smile could have lit up the entire Montana territory. He crossed to where Rebecca sat and, mindful of the baby still in his arms, leaned down to kiss her. It was their first real kiss, gentle and sweet and full of promise. And when they broke apart, Rebecca rested her forehead against his and felt complete in a way she had not known was possible. They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright spring morning in late March when the snow had finally melted and the first shoots of green were appearing in the prairie grass. The ceremony took place in Dillon's small church, with Mrs. Patterson standing up as Rebecca's witness, and the town's blacksmith serving as Frank's. Half the town attended, curious to see the widow marry the quiet cowboy who had built her a house. And if anyone judged the quickness of the courtship or the presence of baby Franklin, who slept peacefully through the entire ceremony, they kept their opinions to themselves. Rebecca wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and she carried a bouquet of the first wildflowers of spring that Frank had ridden out early that morning to collect. Frank wore his best clothes, his dark hair neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaved, and when he promised to love and honor Rebecca for all the days of his life, there was not a person in the church who doubted he meant every word. After the ceremony, Mrs. Patterson hosted a celebration at the boarding house with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the afternoon. Rebecca danced with her new husband while Mrs. Patterson held baby Franklin, and she felt light and happy and full of hope for the first time in longer than she could remember. When they finally returned to the homestead that evening, Frank carried Rebecca over the threshold of what was now truly their home, both of them laughing as he nearly hit her head on the doorframe. They settled Franklin in the cradle Frank had built, and then they stood together looking down at the sleeping baby, Frank's arm around Rebecca's waist and Rebecca's head resting on his shoulder. "I never thought I could be this happy," Rebecca said softly. "Neither did I," Frank admitted. "For a long time after my sister died, I thought maybe I was not meant to have this kind of joy. But then I saw you climbing out of that wagon, and something inside me knew my life was about to change." "You changed my life," Rebecca said, turning to look up at him. "You saved it in every way a person can be saved." "You saved mine too," Frank replied. "You gave me a reason to build something permanent again, to hope for a future, to believe in good things." They kissed again, longer and deeper than the chaste kiss they had shared at their wedding, and when they finally pulled apart they were both breathless. "We should sleep," Rebecca said reluctantly. "Franklin will be awake again in a few hours." "Probably," Frank agreed, but he did not let her go. "Rebecca, I know we have not talked about this, but in terms of more children eventually, I want you to know that I would welcome that, but only when you are ready. There is no rush. Franklin is enough." "I would like more children," Rebecca said. "With you, not right away, but someday. I would like Franklin to have brothers and sisters. I would like to fill this house with a family." "Then that is what we will do," Frank promised. "We will build a family together, you and I will spend every day making sure you never regret giving me this chance." "I could never regret it," Rebecca assured him. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Frank Noble, you and our son." They finally went to bed, lying together in the darkness with Franklin's cradle nearby, and Rebecca felt safe and cherished in a way she had not felt since before her parents died. This was what she had needed all along. Not rescue or charity, but partnership and genuine love. A man who showed his devotion through actions rather than words, who had quite literally built her a foundation for a new life. Spring unfolded into summer, and the homestead flourished under Frank's tireless labor. He planted crops, built a proper barn, and acquired chickens and 2 dairy cows. Rebecca tended a vegetable garden that exploded with produce in the long summer days, and she spent her evenings canning and preserving food for the winter to come. Franklin grew rapidly, his infant features taking on definition, and he began smiling and laughing and reaching for his parents with chubby hands that made them both melt. Neighbors began stopping by regularly, welcoming the noble family into the community. Rebecca made friends with other ranch wives, women who understood the particular challenges and rewards of frontier life. Frank developed a reputation as someone who could be relied upon for help, and he often rode out to assist neighbors with barn raisings or fence mending, building the network of mutual support that was essential for survival in this harsh land. In the fall, Frank built an addition onto the house, adding another bedroom and expanding the main living area. "For when we have more children," he explained to Rebecca, "I want us to have room to grow." "Are you hoping for more children soon?" Rebecca asked, amused by his planning. "Only when you are ready," Frank assured her, "but I am a man who likes to be prepared." As winter approached again, Rebecca realized she was pregnant. She told Frank on a cold November evening, exactly 1 year after he had first told her he loved her, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then set her down carefully and placed both hands on her still flat belly with an expression of wonder. "Another baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Rebecca, you have made me the happiest man alive." "We have made each other happy," Rebecca corrected. "That is how a good marriage works." This pregnancy was easier than her first had been, partly because Rebecca was healthier and better fed, and partly because she was not facing it alone. Frank was attentive without being overbearing, making sure Rebecca rested when she needed to but not treating her like she was made of glass. Franklin was walking now, toddling around the house on unsteady legs, and Rebecca spent her days chasing after him and preparing for the new baby's arrival. The second baby came on a warm June day in 1878, after a short and relatively easy labor that Mrs. Patterson declared was remarkably smooth for a second birth. This time it was a girl, tiny and perfect with a head full of dark hair like her father. "What shall we call her?" Frank asked, cradling his daughter with the same gentle confidence he had shown with Franklin. "I would like to name her after your sister," Rebecca said. "If you would not find that too painful." "What was her name?" "Sarah," Frank said, his voice soft. "Her name was Sarah." "Then this is Sarah," Rebecca declared. "Sarah Noble, born into a family that will love and protect her always." Frank's eyes were wet as he nodded. "Sarah it is. My sister would have loved that. She would have loved you too, Rebecca. You are everything she would have wanted for me." As Sarah grew, the Noble household settled into a comfortable rhythm. Frank continued to work the homestead, gradually expanding their holdings and improving their property. Rebecca managed the house and children with capable efficiency, and together they built a life that was full and good and deeply satisfying. Franklin turned 3 and became a sturdy, adventurous little boy who followed his father everywhere, imitating Frank's walk and speech patterns with adorable accuracy. Sarah was a quieter child, more thoughtful and observant, and she had a special fondness for the chickens that had Frank building her an elaborate coop so she could visit her friends more easily. Rebecca often thought back to that terrible time when she had been alone in a broken wagon, pregnant and desperate, with no clear path forward. It felt like a lifetime ago, like it had happened to a different person. In some ways, she supposed it had. She was not that frightened widow anymore. She was Rebecca Noble, wife and mother, homesteader and community member, a woman who had been given a second chance and had grabbed it with both hands. On their third wedding anniversary, Frank surprised Rebecca by taking her into Dillon for dinner at the hotel restaurant, the fanciest establishment in town. Mrs. Patterson watched the children, and Frank and Rebecca dressed in their best clothes and rode into town in the wagon Frank had recently repaired and painted. Over dinner, Frank reached across the table and took Rebecca's hand. "I have been thinking," he said, "about that first day when I saw you in the wagon. Do you remember what you asked me?" "I asked you what you were doing," Rebecca said, smiling at the memory, "and you said you were building a house." "Right," Frank confirmed, "and you asked why, and I said because you needed it." "But that was not completely true." Rebecca looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean I did not build that house just because you needed it," Frank explained. "I built it because the moment I saw you, something inside me recognized you. I cannot explain it better than that. It was like I had been waiting my whole life without knowing what I was waiting for, and then there you were. I built that house because I was already building a future with you in my mind, even before we spoke a single word to each other." Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes. "Frank Noble, after 3 years of marriage, you still find ways to surprise me." "Good," Frank said, grinning. "I plan to keep surprising you for the next 50 years at least." "Only 50, Rebecca teased. "I was hoping for more than that." "However long we get," Frank said seriously. "However many years God grants us together, I promise you they will be good ones. We will keep building this life together, you and I. More children if you want them, more land, more everything. Whatever you dream of, we will work toward it together." "I do not need more than what we have," Rebecca said honestly. "But I would like another baby or two if we are blessed with them. And I would like to watch Franklin and Sarah grow up strong and happy. And I would like to grow old with you, Frank. That is my dream." "Then that is what we will do," Frank promised. They had 2 more children over the next few years. Another boy they named Thomas after Rebecca's late husband, because Rebecca said it felt right to honor the past even as they built the future. And finally, another girl they named Emma, who turned out to be the most headstrong of all their children. The house Frank had built expanded further to accommodate their growing family, and the homestead prospered under their combined efforts. Franklin grew into a young man who shared his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. He talked about filing his own homestead claim when he came of age, wanting to build something of his own just as his father had. Sarah developed a love for animals and declared her intention to breed horses, a dream Frank encouraged by teaching her everything he knew about horsemanship. Thomas was the scholar of the family, always with his nose in a book, and Emma was pure fire and energy, keeping everyone on their toes. As the years passed and the century drew toward its close, Rebecca and Frank would sometimes sit on the porch of their house in the evening, watching the sun set over the Montana prairie, and marvel at the life they had built from almost nothing. The homestead had become a real ranch, with cattle and horses and fields of wheat that stretched toward the horizon. The house had grown to 8 rooms, with a proper parlor and a dining room large enough to seat their entire family and whatever guests might visit. "You ever regret it?" Rebecca asked Frank one evening when they were both in their 40s, their children grown or nearly so. "Taking on a pregnant widow and all the complications that came with me." Frank turned to look at her, his blue eyes still as clear as they had been the day they met, though his face now bore lines that spoke of years spent outdoors in sun and wind. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Rebecca Noble. You and our family. Building that house was the smartest thing I ever did." "You built me a house before you even knew my name," Rebecca said, shaking her head in wonder. "What kind of man does that?" "The kind of man who knows a good thing when he sees it," Frank replied, pulling her close. "The kind of man who does not wait for permission when he sees someone in need. The kind of man who believes in taking action rather than just talking about it. The kind of man I would follow anywhere," Rebecca said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat together as darkness fell and the stars began to appear, just as they had countless times over the years, and Rebecca felt the same sense of peace and contentment she had first felt that night after their wedding. This was what love was supposed to be. Not the passionate promises Thomas had made and failed to keep, but the steady, constant devotion Frank had shown her from the very beginning. Love was building a house for a stranger because she needed it. Love was working every day to provide for your family. Love was holding your wife when she cried and celebrating with her when she laughed and showing up every single day, year after year, to build a life together. Franklin the younger married a girl from town when he was 22, and they built a house on a section of the noble land that Frank deeded to him. Sarah fulfilled her dream of breeding horses and became known throughout Montana for the quality of her stock. Thomas went east to university, the first in the family to receive formal higher education, and returned with a law degree and plans to practice in Dillon. Emma, true to her fiery nature, refused to settle down young and instead spent several years traveling and teaching school in various frontier towns, before finally returning home at 25 with a wanderer husband in tow. The family expanded with grandchildren, and Frank built an even larger table so everyone could gather for Sunday dinners. Rebecca presided over these gatherings with joy, watching her children and grandchildren interact, seeing how the love she and Frank had built had rippled outward to create this entire network of family and happiness. "We did all right," Frank said to her one Sunday after everyone had left and they were cleaning up together, a task they still insisted on doing themselves despite offers of help. "We did better than all right," Rebecca corrected. "We built something beautiful, Frank. Not just this ranch, but this family. These people who love each other and support each other. That is because of what you and I created together. What I started by building a house," Frank said with a slight smile. "What you started by seeing someone in need and taking action," Rebecca amended. "By being the kind of man who does not wait for others to solve problems. By being kind and good and steady. That is what started all this." As they moved into their 50s, Frank and Rebecca began to slow down, handing over more of the ranch operations to Franklin and his growing family. They had earned their rest, and they spent more time simply enjoying each other's company, taking rides across the prairie they had called home for so many decades, and watching sunsets from their porch. Rebecca's hair was more gray than blonde now, and Frank's face was deeply lined from years in the weather. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young man and pregnant widow who had met beside a broken wagon so many years ago. Time had changed their appearances, but not the essential truth of what they meant to each other. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. Franklin and his wife had 5 children now. Sarah had 3, Thomas had 2, and Emma had just welcomed her first. 13 grandchildren in total, with more surely to come, and every single one of them bore the mark of the love that had started when Frank Noble decided to build a house for a woman whose name he did not even know. 30 years. Rebecca marveled that night when she and Frank were finally alone. 3 decades since you made me the happiest woman alive by agreeing to marry me. Since you made me the happiest man alive by saying yes, Frank corrected. Though I think we both know I was already yours long before that wedding day. You were mine from the moment you started hammering stakes into the ground, Rebecca agreed. I just took a little while to catch up. You were worth the wait, Frank assured her. They made love that night with the comfortable familiarity of long partnership, but also with the tenderness that had never faded between them. Afterward, lying in Frank's arms in the darkness, Rebecca thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The death of her parents that had left her vulnerable to Thomas's charm, the difficult marriage and the gambling and the violence that had ended it, the terrifying months alone on the trail, pregnant and desperate, the broken wagon outside Dillon. And then Frank, appearing like an answer to prayers she had been too frightened to voice, building her a house and a future with his bare hands. "What are you thinking about?" Frank asked, feeling her wakefulness. "About how lucky I am," Rebecca said simply. "About how many things had to happen, both good and bad, to bring me to that wagon outside Dillon at exactly the right moment for you to see me. About how different my life would be if even one small thing had changed. I think we would have found each other somehow," Frank said. "I have to believe that. Some things are just meant to be." "Maybe," Rebecca allowed. "Or maybe we just chose to make it meant to be. Maybe love is not about destiny but about choosing each other every day and putting in the work to build something good." "That sounds like something Thomas would say," Frank observed. "That boy always did think too much." Rebecca laughed softly. "He gets it from me. You know I always think too much." "And I never think enough," Frank said. "That is why we work. You plan and I act, and together we make sense." "Together we make sense," Rebecca repeated, liking the sound of it. "Yes, that is exactly what we do." They grew old together as they had promised, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. Frank's hands became too stiff with age to do all the work he once had, and Rebecca's eyesight faded to the point where she could no longer do the fine sewing she had once excelled at. But they still sat together on the porch every evening, Frank's arm around Rebecca's shoulders, watching the land they had claimed and worked and loved for so many decades. Their children remained close, the family bonds they had forged holding strong through the inevitable challenges and conflicts that arose over the years. The ranch continued to prosper under Franklin's management, and the noble name became synonymous with honesty and hard work throughout Montana. Rebecca was 71 and Frank was 76 when Frank's health finally began to truly fail. It started with a cough that would not go away, and despite Rebecca's fervent care and multiple visits from the doctor who had replaced Mrs. Patterson after her death a decade earlier, Frank grew progressively weaker through the winter of 1925. "I am not ready to let you go," Rebecca told him one cold February evening, sitting beside his bed and holding his hand. "We were supposed to have more time." "We have had 50 years, Frank reminded her, his voice weak but still gentle. 50 years more than I thought I would get when I was drifting aimlessly after Sarah's death. You gave me a life, Rebecca. A real, full, beautiful life. I have no regrets." "I have one," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I regret that I will have to spend any time in this world without you." Frank squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left. "You will not be alone. You will never be alone. Our children and grandchildren, they are all pieces of us. They will take care of you, and I will be waiting for you when your time comes. However long that takes, I will be waiting." "Promise me," Rebecca whispered. "I promise," Frank said. "I promise I will be there on the other side, ready to build us a house in heaven if that is what you need." Rebecca laughed through her tears. You would too. You would spend eternity building me houses." "That does not sound like a bad way to spend eternity," Frank said, smiling faintly. He died 2 days later in the early morning hours, with Rebecca beside him holding his hand, and their children gathered around the bed. His last words were, "I love you," directed at Rebecca, and his last expression was peace. Rebecca grieved deeply, as anyone would after losing a partner of 50 years, but she did not break. She had Frank's strength in her bones now, his steadiness in her spirit. She lived for another 8 years, surrounded by the family they had created, active and engaged with life until the very end. She died peacefully in her sleep at 79, and the family buried her next to Frank on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land, and the family that had grown from the love between a pregnant widow and a cowboy who had built her a house before he even knew her name. The noble ranch continued for generations, passing down through the family along with the story of how it all began. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up hearing about Frank, who had seen a woman in need and taken action, about Rebecca, who had survived impossible odds to build a beautiful life. The house Frank had originally built, expanded and improved over the decades, remained the heart of the ranch, and every noble child learned the lesson at the core of their family history. Love is not just a feeling. Love is action. Love is showing up every day and doing the work. Love is building something solid and lasting, even when everything seems impossible. The story became legend in Dillon and the surrounding territory, passed down not just within the family but throughout the community. The tale of the cowboy who built a house for a stranger became a symbol of what was best about the frontier spirit, the way people looked out for each other and took care of their own. It was told and retold, embellished and simplified, but at its core it remained the same simple truth. Sometimes the most extraordinary things begin with the most basic act of human kindness. And in that house on the Montana prairie, where descendants of Frank and Rebecca still lived more than a century after its founding, visitors could still see the original room Frank had built that autumn in 1876. The walls had been reinforced, and the roof replaced and improvements made throughout the years, but the bones of that first structure remained, solid and strong, just like the love that had inspired its creation. It stood as testament to what one man with determination and compassion could build, and to what two people working together could create. In the end, Rebecca and Frank's story was not about rescue or salvation, though elements of both were present. It was about partnership and choice and the decision to build something good together. It was about a man who saw someone in need and took action without hesitation or expectation of reward. It was about a woman who found the courage to accept help and then to open her heart to love again after loss. It was about hard work and quiet devotion and the kind of everyday heroism that built the West. And it all started with a broken wagon, a pregnant widow, and a cowboy who built her a house before he even knew her name.